I will just, okay, brilliant. Okay, well, let's get started. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. Just to give you a quick overview, if you haven't joined one of these sessions before, my name is Oliver Crofton. I'm CEO and co-founder of Continual. We are a technology platform which powers the compliance and ethics program for organizations, everything from whistleblowing through to guiding you through frameworks related to corporate governance and ethics. These sessions are very informal. I'll be asking our guest a series of questions around their subject matter. And we really want to get feedback from you. If you have specific questions or issues that you want to raise, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. There will be some output from this as well in notes that I will circulate after this session. But as I said, please do raise any questions you have. I'm really pleased to be joined by our guest today. He's quite a shining light in the world of cybersecurity. He's considered to be a subject matter expert, and he's kindly agreed to share some of his insights and feedback today. What I would say, this is a session for non-technical people. So although we are diving into a subject that can be perceived as quite technical, we will be talking in a non-technical way. So we're focused, I can see that during the attendee list is mostly general counsel, HR leaders and compliance leaders. So that's the type of people and roles that will be tailored towards. So Jamie, rather than me introducing you, if you could please give us a quick overview of who you are, introduce yourself, introduce CyberSmart, what you do, and give us a bit of your background in cybersecurity.
Thank you, Oliver. I think that's probably the nicest thing anyone said on my intro. A shining light in the world of cyber. I need to update my bio for that one. And thank you for that. So I've spent the last 15 years working in technology and cybersecurity. Initially working on building technology, so building systems, software, helping companies to digitize, to embrace the world of the social media and the internet. So moving a lot of businesses online, really, back in the earlier days. And then throughout the middle, more focused on cybersecurity. So have done everything from the technical parts of cybersecurity, security testing, security architecture, up to the really fun bits, governance, risk, and compliance. I know many on the call are focused in this area. I actually find it a fascinating area, in particular, how you drive the organizational change through aspects around compliance and governance, how you not only step through that, meet your compliance regulations, but embody it into the culture of the organization. So I did quite a bit of work around that. Things like ISO 27001, PCI DSS, so cardholder data, and quite interested in that area too. And then most recently, so for the last 9 years, founded and I'm the CEO at a company called CyberSmart. We help to make security accessible. It's a real focus for us, is helping organizations, particularly SMEs, to understand how to implement and maintain good cybersecurity practice. We work with over 6,000 customers across the UK, who are pretty much in every sector possible. And our real USP is making things simple, accessible, and straightforward. So hopefully today we can get through this entire webinar without any acronyms. If we do, then we'll bust them on the spot. But yeah, the whole focus is about how we can talk to some of the nuance around cybersecurity, resilience, corporate governance, and hopefully have a good discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jamie. I think the point you make about governance, risk, and compliance within the cyber sphere is something that will resonate well with our attendees today, because there's a constant journey to try and improve and enhance governance, risk, and compliance across other areas outside of cyber. So I'm sure there's some learnings and some common objectives that we can discuss. To kick us off, I'd like to just get from your vantage point, what are some of the biggest changes you're seeing in the cyber risk landscape in 2025 compared to a few years ago? Could you just give us an overview on that?
Yes, I'll probably look at it from a few perspectives. Initially, regulation. So we're seeing the introduction of, and I presume on the call we've got organizations that trade in the UK as well as Europe, the US. So a shift in the regulatory landscape. Many of people on the call will have heard that Network Information Systems Directive 2 or NIS 2. Funnily enough, this was introduced, NIS 1 was introduced at the same time as GDPR, had far less fanfare. The big change and shift in the regulation is really around the scope. So lots more organizations, probably 10 times more organizations, are now being included into scope. Anyone who forms part of those critical supply chains is now considered critical national infrastructure. Potentially about 300,000 organizations across Europe are now having to read and understand this regulation. So there's a big shift there. The UK's post-Brexit answer to Network Information System Directive, or NIS, is the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, or CSRB. So the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill is being introduced by UK government to essentially ensure equivalence with Europe. So very similar type of legislation, similar types of fines, requirements around incident reporting within certain time periods. And again, the scope being increased to all the critical suppliers to infrastructure. So not just the big defense contractors or like main water suppliers, but lots of organizations that work closely with those companies as well. And so that's a big shift in the regulatory landscape. I presume we're probably going to talk about AI later on in the call, but there's also introductions like AI Act across Europe. So theme number one really is regulation. Regulation is really starting to shift. It's becoming, I would say, more explicit in what the obligations or requirements on business are. So whereas before you could kind of interpret it and subjectively implement that using a risk-based approach, now they're far more prescriptive in the timelines you have to do stuff, the requirements you need to meet, the level of evidence that you need to produce, etc. So that's probably the first area for organizations to wrap their heads around, understand what regulations are coming, which might apply to them, and how and what timelines they might need to implement them. The second area I would say is, as it pertains to cybersecurity risk and resilience, is around the evolving threat landscape. So this is probably no surprise to anyone, but the number of incidents and the number of attacks is going up, and it almost feels like a never-ending battle. And we're definitely not winning this battle. When we started CyberSmart 9 years ago, we hoped to turn the tables and shift the underlying economics of cybercrime by raising the bar. Then it would make it far harder for criminals to get to the goods, and therefore it would become a less profitable activity. Unfortunately, it seems to have continued to become more profitable through things like ransomware as a service. So very similar to software as a service, criminal organizations, you can now become an affiliate or a member of these organizations at very, very low cost and start distributing ransomware. So the access to criminal actors has increased. They are obviously using tools, automation, and now even AI to write things like very convincing phishing emails. Very rarely do you have spelling mistakes now coming through in the phishing emails. They're very using increasingly sophisticated tactics. So a couple over the last week using like the autoresponders or Amazon's email service to send emails. That's seemingly legitimate, very, very hard to spot from regular phishing attacks. So under theme 2 is really about the rising frequency and sophistication of the criminal actors. So the bad guys are definitely leveling up their skills along this, and therefore we inevitably need to level up our defenses to cope with those kind of challenges. So I'd say those are like probably the two big ones. So the organizations being aware of their regulation and the evolving threat landscape. The third one, I think, we'll probably dive a bit deeper into, but it's the continued acceleration of digital adoption. So increasingly, systems are being connected. We've got industrial control systems that are going online. organizations want to embrace technology and digitization. The pandemic clearly accelerated that significantly. And last but not least, organizations want to adopt AI and into their organizations. They want to share their data with models, and that's opens up a whole new set of opportunities for an organization, but also a significant set of risks that need to be managed too. So increased digitization and acceleration through things like AI will continue to proliferate. Unfortunately, I'm painting a pretty bleak picture of the world right now, but I'm sure we'll come on to what organizations can do about some of these things.
You are, Jamie, but it's important, okay? And part of this, well, the theme of this webinar is around cybersecurity not being just an IT problem. And what you've talked about there does cover the whole business. You talked about the evolving threat landscape. Just briefly, what does that look like? Because there's been loads of stuff in the press. We've seen M&S, we've seen the co-op ransomware, obviously, have a massive impact. And we briefly talked about the Jaguar Land Rover issue that's currently underway. And you mentioned another business, logistics business you spoke with recently that had gone out of business because of a ransomware attack. Ransomware seemed sort of five or plus years ago, ransomware was really commonplace, and it sort of went away for a little while, but it seems to have be coming back. What are the trends around that threat landscape that you're seeing?
There's some. It's a bit of a black box. The world of cyber criminals. So a lot of the research around this topic is observed research, reported research, and not everything gets observed or reported clearly. And so there are some really good reports and trends, like Coveware, for example, produce a quarterly report on ransomware specifically, looking at what are the most common attack vectors. So is it phishing, or is it an unpatched piece of software? Is it remote desktop protocol, a very common protocol that is often exploited by criminals? And they kind of track this over time. And what you kind of see is these things go through waves or trends. So what typically happens is the defenses increase, and then the bad actors shift to another form of attack that is more effective and is going to be less likely to be picked up. And they're constantly looking for new weaknesses and new holes in the system. They will exploit things like the adoption of AI to build, for example, fake ChatGPT style websites where people that are just starting to use it may not know whether or not it's a real version. So they're constantly looking for new angles like this, but also they'll come back to old ones that were previously successful, and companies may have shifted their focus away from. And so it is an evolving landscape where they will often bring back old tactics or techniques, maybe for a new medium. So we're starting to see, for example, criminals exploit the AI used in email filters. So emails will be filtered by an AI engine, and they'll look for like bad words, etc. So I saw a couple of weeks ago one of the first prompt injections. So that's essentially a piece of text that's been written to trick the AI, specifically written for the AI, to tell the AI to spend lots of time thinking about that email, and to basically go into like a recursive loop, so it never actually classifies it as a bad email. I thought that was a really interesting attack technique that we're starting to see evolve. But to your question, some of the main sources are still the main sources that we saw probably 4 or 5 years ago. So phishing, some technical security elements. So anything like protocol related, remote desktop protocol being the most common. Unpatched software, still a really big one as well. And a kind of a more broad theme is MFA, or multi-factor authentication, still not being in commonplace across all organizations, is still a massive entry point. Unfortunately, 19% plus of all breaches still come from a handful of specific attack vectors or areas for that they start off with, and those are still very common because the baselines are not in place across all organizations.
I've got a question. I'm going to ask it now whilst we're on the subject. And I appreciate we could probably do a whole session about this question, but just to get your immediate thoughts on what considerations should we have when exploring whether to pay a ransom?
Oh, that is a really good question. I guess the first one is probably like if you can. Increasingly, governments are looking at legislating against this. Uh, I don't know many that have gone as far to say that they're not going to allow it at all. So, for example, in the UK, they're looking at a mandatory disclosure around that, which I think is a reasonable step. I think gaining visibility to that makes sense for governments so they can better equip organizations and get an idea of the true scale of problem. Australia's implemented legislation along those lines as well. So I guess the first one is can you legally? Secondly, like what's your insurer's stance on it? I think it was AIG. It might be AIG, AXA, one or one of the French subsidiaries, I believe, said their policies would no longer pay out ransomware claims. So that's something to check on your insurance policy. What is that allowed and supported? They're often like one of the most key elements when it comes to dealing with the criminal actors and negotiating ransoms. The logistics company who we did a webinar with yesterday was actually on Panorama and BBC recently, and they had their insurance company was on the front line of negotiating with the bad actors in order to figure out how much it would cost them. In the end, they didn't pay the ransom, but they have significant experience with these criminal groups that they're named. They know who the top 20 are. They know typically how much money they ask for. Interestingly, they'll look at things like your insurance documents to look at your limit, and they'll ask for that amount. They'll look at your financial records, how much money do you have in your bank, and they'll ask for that amount. And if you say, "Oh, we can only pay 100K," they say, "No, you've got 2 million in your bank. I think you can do 500K." So they're really quite sophisticated. So I think you're probably better off probably best off engaging a professional. If you do have an insurer, they're your first line of support. If you don't have an insurer, then engaging a professional incident response firm will have experience dealing with hundreds of these types of cases, and that should factor in. The last one is your ability to recover and effectively get back on your feet. In some cases, you may be forced to if you have no meaningful way of getting back to a good state. So if you haven't built the resilience you haven't got sufficient backups, or they haven't been isolated, and you haven't tested that protocol, then there may be a situation where actually, 2 weeks even, or 4 weeks of downtime, or potentially much longer if you lose access to key systems, is not feasible or sustainable for the business, and therefore you may be forced into that. That's all the ethical considerations aside, right? So the general stance is by paying ransoms, we fuel the industry, the bad side industry, and make it just like with terrorism. You don't want to encourage that, or kidnapping. You don't want to encourage that. So the general rule is to not pay. But I think in specific cases, it may make sense for organizations to decide to do so.
Are there specific industries where it's more commonplace? I'm just thinking healthcare, for example, where you may have infrastructure that that is life and death. Are there areas like that are more prone to paying, or should look at things in a different way?
I think there's probably stats on this specific. I haven't seen any, but I'd say probably businesses where they have less of an ability to recover, or the cost of business interruption is significantly high. So areas like manufacturing, for example, you take down a plant and stop them from functioning pretty quickly. They need to get back on their feet. The costs are astronomical. Organizations like professional services firms, where maybe using all cloud, for Office 365 or something like that, probably more resilient just by the nature of their technology and the way they're set up. Larger firms probably suffer more because they have more systems, more processes, potentially legacy involved in there as well. So yeah, it probably depends more on the organization size, their approach to resilience pre-incident, and their ability to recover.
So I feel like we've got got a bit of a handle on the threat landscape. I
Yeah.
feel suitably terrified and worried about everything. So let's move on from there. Um, let's look at the role of non-technical leaders. So people that are used to managing governance, risk, and compliance, perhaps from a non-technology based way. We talked when we were setting up this session about some of the silos that people experience within an
Mhm.
organization where IT quite often can be siloed from the rest of the business and it is run slightly separately. Can you give us some practical ways that general counsel, HR, and compliance leaders can collaborate with IT to break down those silos?
I think in context for this, there's something really interesting said at a conference called Cyber UK. That's the National Cyber Security Centre's annual conference. They talked about finance and accounting has been around for centuries, and cyber is a pretty new risk for organizations and boards to grapple with. And I feel like sometimes we are a bit unfair when it comes to board's expectation to know this subject inside out, just because it's not been around long enough. There are very few. There's actually a shortage of qualified security professionals in the field, let alone people that understand the field itself. I probably the first thing, and it's a theme when we come to talk about cybersecurity and how it pertains to our interactions with it, is we have to be human about it and understand that people just don't have the amount of experience or exposure to these types of topics too. So firstly, be compassionate when it comes to these topics.
Mhm.
I'd say um, that there is an obligation and an onus on technical and cybersecurity CIOs, CISOs to explain things in a way that boards can understand. Boards are comfortable and familiar with risk, generally speaking. So they're familiar with cost benefit analysis. And so I think presenting things in a way that makes sense, just as you would present a case for investing in a new piece of equipment, I think you should be bringing topics, cybersecurity topics. And if you're not, clearly for those not on the call, speaking to your peers who are technical or focused on these areas and asking them, could you explain it like we explain this type of problem? Because that will help me to understand it. I think that's probably the first area is like get the language and the format and the presentation. No one wants to sit for a 24-page slide deck on managed detection and response and how that works and how it's going to give you all these new technical capabilities. Explain it in simple risk terms. I get it's difficult to quantify often, like the actual ROI can be much harder to see, but the closer you get to what boards used to seeing, I think the more likely it is to get discussed robustly in relation to other investments. So I'd say that's probably the first area that boards can engage with this topic. I'd say secondly, for the non-technical people, spend a bit of time to familiar yourself with some of the key areas, like understanding like the NIST model. So understanding that the first step is to identify what assets you have in the organization and to protect them and to be able to respond and recover, etc. There's a really good resource. Maybe we can send out in an email afterwards a bunch of resources.
Mm-hmm.
But the NCSE has put together a really good toolkit for boards that essentially step you through understanding it. It probably takes about an hour or so to complete these modules, but they give you a really good baseline understanding for how a board should think about cyber, some of the questions you should ask if you're presented with something to understand measures around that. Those are probably the ones that come to mind at first. I think there's probably more than ever an onus on boards to engage with this. There are some research around this. The percentage of boards that have a cybersecurity professional or an expert or someone with knowledge of the field is going down, unfortunately.
Wow.
It went down in the recent cybersecurity breaches survey. And so that's not necessarily a problem if the rest of the board's comfortable with the topic. It is a problem if the rest of the board isn't. So I think making yourself aware, asking the people that are aware to explain. There's one other point I think relevant to this, something that I heard again at Cyber UK, was inviting a subject matter expert to the board to explain the topic. So we talked a bit about the evolving threat landscape, inviting someone who understands like financial services, for example, what they've seen across other organizations, similar shape and size, how they're thinking about cybersecurity, how they're thinking about resilience, like giving some examples and case studies can be really, really helpful. So inviting an expert to the board can also be helpful. So three things there: asking the technical or cyber person to explain things in a language board understands, gaining a basic level of education yourself, and inviting some experts to the board.
Great, that's a helpful outline. It's been said many times within the cyberspace that people are your first and the most important line of defense. But what does that mean? What does that mean in real terms when someone says people are your first line of defense in cyber?
In real terms, it means that they're the people that will initially either respond to, let's say, a phishing email or initiate an action. Many attacks still originate with some element of social engineering. So if that line of defense is strong, in other words, they are trained to spot good versus bad, they have cognitive capacity to do so, so they're not under significant stress or pressure, and there's a route for them to say, hey, this doesn't look quite right, to report it without any repercussions, then that means it's a strong line of defense. If your people are under significant stress and pressure, there is no effective way for them to report stuff, or in some cases they're told, just focus on doing your job, don't worry about that, that's someone else's problem, and there isn't a supportive culture there, then they can become essentially a point of weakness, and that's also why you hear the weakest link phrase.
The notion of building a resilient culture is something that compliance leaders are very familiar with, and we have to do on a daily basis. So what can leaders do to build a culture that you've seen work well within the technical and cybersecurity space, where employees feel empowered to report and share issues without the fear of repercussion? Because if you click a link that you suddenly realize, oh crikey, I probably shouldn't have done that, or put my details in. In other areas of corporate governance, risk and compliance, there's an issue of payback where someone is reporting wrongdoing within an organization, and there's lots of work being done around how to reduce that. What have you seen within the technical sphere that has worked well, that people feel comfortable to report things when they've done something that perhaps they think, oh crikey, I shouldn't have done that?
Culture in cyber has many parallels to other areas. Health and safety is a really good example. So asking yourself the same question of how have you, if that is important for your organization, how have you done the same for health and safety? Nobody gets fired for reporting like a broken tap or whatever. So like it's just how things are done. So removing the stigma around it being a bad thing, and actually it's a good thing, you're making us more strong and more secure, is important. There's probably some prerequisites too, like these are quite tactical elements around like how incident reporting, having a process for it, etc. More importantly, everyone, like many elements of culture, it has to be something that comes from the top. Everyone in the organization has to take this seriously. You want to hear the board CEO talking about this. Our customers and their data is really important. Our suppliers are really important to us, and our overall resilience of business is very important. And therefore, we're going to invest in making this work. Issues happen. I know I've clicked things before that I shouldn't have. As long as we report it and we can deal with it, because that's where the significant costs come, then we'll be good as a business. And so it has to be a whole company approach to it. It has to be more than just a policy. It has to be something that people see and they experience on a day-to-day basis. So I think some of those kind of building blocks need to be in place first, and then you can put in an incident reporting process and remove any disciplinary procedures around things like that.
with the threats being so rife, a breach at some point is probably quite likely. If a
Mhm.
breach does happen, how can HR, legal, and compliance best support employees who may be directly impacted?
That's a really, really good question, quite nuanced actually. I'm going to answer first about the organization's perspective. You'll probably hear me say this a few times. If you don't have cyber insurance, it's a vital lifeline when the breach happens, and they will help you navigate large parts of the incident response and give you tested playbooks for things like this. So,
Mhm.
like how to not only the kind of technical or criminal side, but also like how to respond to the press, etc. When it comes to the HR specifically, I'd say it's really important you create a transparent and an open line of communication with your employees and your staff. Slightly different to the response you might have externally, which is where you probably want to verify the facts before you communicate something out. Lots of examples of where that hasn't worked well. Also, lots of examples where it has worked really well.
Mhm.
So externally, that probably needs some specialist crisis comms PR. Internally, I think you want to be open and transparent. Say this is what's happening to us. We're still establishing the facts on the issue. Um, we are not we, we have invested in this area. We are not punishing anyone. For example, if someone thinks, oh, was it me? Was it someone else, etc. And we want your full support in dealing with this. So I think being just like you would do with any crisis, really, like being open and transparent as to the extent that you can be with your team, and helping them to understand what the future looks like. So is this something that you are going to be able to recover from and work through? In most cases, it will be for most organizations. And so explaining that this is what the impacts look like. We expect this will take us this amount of time to resolve.
Mhm.
And I think that's pretty much standard in the HR playbook. A HR professional are probably some of the most adept at dealing with crises and challenges externally imposed and communicating those.
I think it's probably overlooked following a breach, though, where the person who actually was perhaps the source of the issue, most likely unknowingly, doesn't get any support, and they see the aftermath of it, and it can really, be problematic for that person, I suspect, if you're the cause of a business interruption. I'm conscious of time. I want to move on to, you mentioned it a couple of times around third party risk, and I think you said
Mhm.
300,000 companies are they falling under the supply chain of critical national infrastructure? Did you say? Oh,
NIS, Network Information System Directive, so the EU's
oh,
legislation
right.
in the
Okay.
UK. I'm not quite sure on the full extent of it. It may be for 30,000 or something of that type of
Right.
magnitude.
But can you just give us an overview of why third party risk is such a major concern right now?
For a few reasons. One is we increasingly rely and share data with third parties, and that's a trend that continues to go. So as businesses become I think there was an example of Sainsbury's flour supplier, maybe going back quite a few years ago now, but they got breached. They had all their customer details that had ordered flowers via Sainsbury's. Obviously, from the customer's perspective, Sainsbury's has had the breach, but it's a supplier that had
Mm.
the incident. And the more that we use third parties and share data with third parties, the bigger that attack surface looks. So that's essentially more contextual piece. The they are increasingly being, sorry to come back to this, but they are increasingly targeted by the bad actors as a way into the larger organizations. Why try and go through into the massive fort when you can just go through the little
Mm.
back door over there? And often, again, those systems are connected up. And you think about like NHS, lots of smaller organizations have access to NHS systems, and therefore they can be an easier, a softer target, if you like, to get into large databases or access to more sensitive networks. So, like purely from a accessibility point, they can be easier to reach. Um, I think the third aspect to third party risk is the the information asymmetry around that. It's really hard to understand how secure an organization is from the outside in. And so traditionally, we relied on things like supply chain questionnaires, where we ask people about their security posture, especially with SMEs. That can often be quite difficult because they might not know what's being asked of them. They're being sent 400 questions in an Excel document, and they're like, they hire someone to come and tell them what they mean. And they need to go and implement a lot of technical controls. So get how some of the ways you can get around this are streamlining your supply chain assurance using certifications or things like ISO 27001 Cyber Essentials as a proxy for security. If someone's gone through that process, they can essentially comply once and then demonstrate that to lots of their customers at one time. So using compliance platform definitely helps to streamline that. So those are, I think, the three main areas: the increasingly connected nature of supply chains of third parties, the kind of shift in attack landscape towards weaker entry points, so third party suppliers, and the kind of difficult to assess nature of third party risk and resilience.
I think from a GRC perspective, the understanding, I'm not speaking to any business that actually has a true grasp on what their third party landscape looks like, where a list of all their vendors. How does that work from a cybersecurity perspective in terms of identifying what your actual third party landscape looks like?
You're not alone in that opinion. I'm just trying to remember the stat in this. So Department of Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, published an annual cybersecurity breaches survey. Really interesting read, some good stats in there to like familiar yourself with. And within there, from memory, 14% of organizations assess their direct suppliers for cyber risk, and only 50% of large organizations assess their direct suppliers for cyber risk. So never mind second or third. And that for me seems crazy that 50% of large organizations don't know how secure the people that are handling their data and they're probably pretty critical to their business infrastructure are. So it's really, really difficult. It's really challenging to understand cyber risk in there.
Good advice around looking at when you do know what they are, what your suppliers are, around looking for those accreditations. I'm sure there's some learnings that can be shared between IT teams and GRC teams within an organization around understanding what that supply chain looks like, because usually when a new vendor is proposed, it goes through general counsel or a compliance manager in some way, but often it's not necessarily the case.
Well, I'll give one practical tip on this. Given the state, most organizations are not doing this. Is, I guess, with any project, start small. If you simply just listed your top 10 suppliers, who are your 10 most critical suppliers? If they went down tomorrow, your business would stop functioning. And it might be 10, it might be 5, it might be 20. But start with that list and ensure they have some security measures in place. And again, start small. Look if they have any security credentials, like certifications. Look at their security policies that they published, and ask them, like, what are you doing in terms of cybersecurity? Even if you just did that, you would get a fairly good idea of at least your key business assessment, and you would be ahead of 50% of all large orgs and 86% of all organizations in the UK, just by doing that simple step, just by taking that one step.
Right. That's helpful. Looking forward at regulation and legislation, what we're seeing governments around the world tighten rules outside of cybersecurity, and the EU AI Act, albeit it has a cyber element. One of those things we've seen the failure to prevent fraud legislation come into law from the 1st of this month. And it seems that the governments are pushing more responsibility onto organizations to self-govern and self-police, because they just don't have the resources and the ability to investigate or to support companies following these sorts of crimes. What should organizations be preparing for in the next 12 to 24 months from a cybersecurity standpoint?
As it pertains to AI governance?
No, just regulation and legislation from a cybersecurity standpoint. We won't touch too much on the AI compliance because we did a webinar last month solely on the EU AI Act and AI governance and compliance. So we sort of covered that quite well. But really, from a cybersecurity standpoint, what regulation legislation in the round, maybe not specifics if you can, but in general as well, what have you seen within the industry being talked about?
Probably the ones we've listed so far, and I maybe add a couple more. So if you're trading in the EU Network Information System Directive, if you are part of that, and you can go and assess whether or not you fall in that scope. If you're in the UK Cybersecurity Resilience Bill, I think it's still worth organisations, especially medium or large organisations, reviewing what's in that legislation. There's nothing stopping you from starting to implement some of the practices or requirements in there proactively. One of the steps or frameworks that I recommend often is Cyber Assessment Framework, or CAF. It's a UK government developed framework. It's used by large parts of government, increasingly by the NHS, and it's starting to feature in the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. CAF, again, I'll include this in the follow-up resources. It's a really structured way, principles-driven way of assessing where you're at and implementing good practice. And they have things they call indicators of good practice with nice and clear examples about how you might see that embodied in your organization. So NIS, or Network Information Systems Directive, Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. The other one I would say is EU AI Act, and if that pertains to your organization, like with all these frameworks, regulations we've talked about, first step in all of them is figuring out whether or not you're in scope. However, I would say reading them is still probably going to give you a good idea and almost a steering point when it comes to think about your organization, if you are on the cusp of that, for example.
Yeah, that's helpful. How can legal and compliance teams stay ahead of these changes without being overwhelmed? Because there is a lot coming at them. So what sort of specific resources should we keep an eye on? I think you probably mentioned a few, but just
government publications like Department of Culture, Media and Sport have a good blog. National Cybersecurity Centre, again, a good blog. I'm sure, Oliver, you're publishing some good stuff around this. So yeah, a lot of the legal firms also publish articles on this. I'd say there's a lot. There is a lot, and a lot of things we talked about. Like a lot of these might come like one a year type thing. There are quite a lot condensed right now. The hard bit isn't probably staying up to date on what's coming. It's probably the assessment of where you stand and relate. Well, one, are you applicable? That's probably pretty straightforward. But two, where do you stand in relation to that? How are you 30% ready? Are you 90% ready? Because if you're 30%, you probably need that time to actually implement the change management in the organization, systems, processes, etc.
Great. I'm going to try. I've weaved a few questions in as we've gone, so hopefully we're covering everything as we go. I'd like to try and just to give some practical takeaways and a checklist from you. And I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I'm going to. If you had to give our audience a governance focused checklist of 3 things to do tomorrow, what would they be?
One, familiarize yourselves with the basics when it comes to cybersecurity, resilience, and governance. Spend a few hours learning the fundamentals of the topic, because it will make everything much easier to engage with. It doesn't need to be some alien, scary thing that is just so complex. I'd say that's probably the first one for people to take away. Secondly, I'll probably expand on the first one. familiarize yourself with a few of the concepts that we've talked about.
Mhm.
Cybersecurity Resilience Bill, what is it? Who does it affect? What is the cyber assessment framework? Could that be relevant and useful for your organization? So I think developing a baseline understanding is probably the most useful starting point. It'll mean next time someone raises one of these topics, you can have an opinion on it and you can engage with the discussion, or you can ask questions about it rather than simply just consuming what's being said.
Mhm.
Secondly, treat cyber just as you do any other risk. Make sure it is on the board agenda, make sure it has priority there. Treat it as you would broad general business resilience. Treat the topics that are within it like you would a business case, albeit it can be difficult, but try and standardize them as much as possible, like you do other topics on the board and the governance level.
Mm-hmm.
And thirdly, I think you touched on this quite a bit throughout, but cybersecurity and resilience is actually more of a human and a governance issue than it is a technical one. And I'll give you a very simple example of this. Patch management. So we all know what patch management is. When your Windows or your Mac or your phone tells you have a software update or a piece of software is out of date, you need to update it. And for organizations, you have to do this systemically across lots of devices too. So it seems like a very technical issue. But in reality, you have people that are managing the rollout of software. You have users that may need to interact with that piece of software to restart or close the application. Apple had to change their user experience because people were clicking defer for years at a time. So now it says patch now or patch tonight, not defer. So that what is seemingly a very technical issue is actually a very human issue because it involves people doing something at some point in time. And many issues in cyber are actually more broadly human and governance, not least responding to an incident. The quicker you can respond and the more effectively you can retain that, the lower the costs will ultimately be to the organization. It can be the difference between a business having a bad day and going out of business. So the more you treat cyber as a human and governance issue and less as a technical one, I think the better it was. So those are probably my three on the spot top things.
I like to keep it fresh, Jamie. You handle that very well, so thank you for giving.
I think it was all fresh because I don't remember any of these questions.
I feel like we could talk all afternoon. I'd like to draw us to a conclusion now. We tried to end on the 50-minute mark if we can. For people that are here, how can they reach out to you if they've got follow-up questions? Can they reach out to you or your team, or how can people get hold of you if they want to follow up with you directly?
They can reach out to me. I'm Jamie at cybersmart.co.uk. If they're interested in about what they do, you can check out the website, cybersmart.co.uk, and the team will be happy to talk you through what we do. Our main focus around helping people to implement and maintain best practice, particularly around cyber essentials. If that's something that's relevant to your organization or your suppliers, feel free to reach out and we'll see what we can do to help.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We're going to conclude the session now, and I wish everybody has a good afternoon. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Oliver.
Bye-bye.